We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to another recording of the Mankind podcast. I am your host, Brandon Cliff, for this episode as we dive into the magician archetype with author, Jungian analyst, and many other amazing roles and titles, Douglas Gillette. For this intro, though, I've had my fellow friend and co-host of the show, Paul Newell, join me to kind of set things up for the magician archetype, because we are actually just coming off our weekly strategy conversation that we have around the podcast. And I was sharing about the interview I have with Doug that you're about to listen to. And it was so interesting how we brought up some examples that perhaps contextually will kind of frame the magician for you before we get into it. But first things first, Paul, mate, welcome to the intro. How you doing?
Blessings. So good to be on this intro with you and talk about this specifically. Mm-hmm. Love it.
Yeah, seriously. So the magician archetype, most often is blamed. It's the scapegoat for the challenges that men face. I mean, in men's work, I've heard it all the time. It's like, oh, it's my fucking magician again. It's, shadow magician, the trickster, the whatever. And as Doug and I will share in the episode, the magician's misrepresented in so many ways. Yes, it is the hardest of all archetypes to reach gold or to become fulfilled, because of you got to let go, which is, we'll get into that in the interview.
Ooh, that's a whole other thing, Brandon.
It's a whole other thing, right? So, but the magician itself gets blamed because it's the thinker, right? It's the thinker. I think of the mind when I think of my magician. Paul and I in the strategy call just started jamming on Robin Williams, Will Smith, many of these kind of jesters that we've been raised with. Obviously, as the time of the release of this, the Oscars have just occurred. And, as we know, Will Smith and Chris Rock had their interaction. But recently I was reading Will Smith's book. And in his book, he talks about his survival mechanism to deal with his dad's anger and his mum's, I guess, sort of indifference, but in her own survival method. His reaction, his survival was to perform. If he could just get dad to laugh or mum to smile, that's how he could survive. Whereas his brother's survival mechanism was to fight and his sister's was to flee. And in his book, he makes very clear that the Will Smith that you've grown to know and love over the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s is not actually him. It was the performer. It was this jester, this magician that had to manipulate the situation to be happy all the time, to be up. So Paul, you shared something quite interesting with, in reference to your experience as a black man, there were these kind of low-hanging fruits of how to perform and survive. Do you mind going into those?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought, because when you started saying that, I said, for me as a man of color, I was like, it's which way do I want to survive, right? Because I can either be the warrior and be like the boxer and like, okay, I'm going to fight my way out of my situations when I get scared or when I'm in fear, or I'm going to be the one that's the jokester that makes people laugh, that makes people feel comfortable, that makes people feel like, oh man, like that's a funny dude, man. Okay, get out of here, go do your thing, so I could take the pressure off of myself. Even when, growing up as a divorced kid, my thing as the youngest one of the family is to be the one that make everyone laugh, perform, do some Michael Jackson moonwalks and stuff like that, be the entertainer, right? Because like and again, I think that's how my judgment is, like, that's how men think that they can get love, right? That they can get respect, they can get appreciation. But even as a man of color, it's like there's a concept of code switching, right? And for me, it's like, okay, code switching, for those that are like, what is that? It's like I can act one way in front of a group of white people, and then I can act another way in front of a group of black people. I can act another way when I'm on the job. I can act another way when I'm in my personal life.
Masks.
And the masks, right? And what is the mask? The mask is an illusion. It's a parlor trick. It's a way of freeing you of your current situation to have you escape into a realm, this magic fantasy land, which, like you just mentioned, Gandalf, right? All like the guy, the guardian at the threshold, the one that tells you like you're about to like moving the hands, you're about to do something different and go somewhere different. That's the magic of the magician. Yeah. I think what I'm excited to really hear is like there's this perception of the magician as negative. And I think that's where the mysticism of being able to live in the two worlds, right, is like something that is a pull in men, right? And I'm excited to hear this conversation that you all have, because when a man fails to acknowledge how they move in the two worlds, that's when a lot of my judgment, that's when a lot of the havoc comes up.
Big time. And it's twofold. See, you're battling when you're in the shadow of the magician, you're battling on two fronts.
Right.
You're manipulating the world out there, and then you're manipulating the world in here.
Can I get an amen?
Yeah, because the magician, part of what has people fall into the shadow side of the magician is judgment, story, non-reality.
Yeah.
Right. The grass is blue and sky is green all of a sudden. And when I'm in that shadow magician, my magician's just trying to survive or thrive through this world of illusion, through just that which isn't real. And these stories that can be created can completely, we did an interview, a whole episode on this, how your story colors your world. I recommend people go back and listen to it. It goes into the shadow magician and that story. It makes me think as well about one aspect of the shadow magician, which is the denying joker. Often seen as smiling depression, the person that will take pot shots at themselves before you ever do. I'll joke about my weight before you do. Yep, I've experienced men of color as well make racist jokes directed at themselves before someone else does.
Right. Ease the pressure out of the room. But then you think of someone, and look, I never knew Robin Williams outside of movies and television, but a lot of people who do know him will tell you that one of his greatest struggles in life was the quiet, was not performing, was not being in front of people to express and show off this extension of who he was. But twofold, it was also the challenge was being in the public eye and not being able to be himself. He had to be Patch Adams. He had to be these characters, this caricature that people had built in their minds. Because if he was not meeting the world's expectations of him, then he wasn't worthy. And unfortunately, we lost him. Yeah, man. As you're saying that, man, it's so potent, because like I wish I could have had a conversation with him, because I think in those situations for men that live that type of life, it can be a slight reframe of what are you creating, because Robin Williams was creating these environments for other people, yet failed to acknowledge like what's the environment that I'm creating for myself. Yeah. And I think as a man, and I'm excited to hear what you two discuss, is like, listen, this magician energy is creator energy. I think one of the reasons it gets stuck or it's lost for men is because our sexual energy, which is creative energy in our sacral chakra, is completely out of alignment and underdeveloped. We have no idea, except for procreation. We have little idea of what it means to truly create. And when we fail to acknowledge that part, that's when we live. I think that's when we live in that shadow magician.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And that's a whole other can of worms when we get into sexual energy. I'm a white belt in that stuff. I can tell you that. That's a big one, which I'm looking forward to when you bring that to the show. But for those of you listening, just know that the magician, yes, it can be the big bad when it comes to shadow and our behaviors, but really think before you blame your magician for your behaviors. First of all, we can't blame our archetypes for anything. We are the ones who behave and act and think and feel, right? So these archetypes aren't scapegoats that we can just pass the blame and the weight to.
Right.
But before you associate any negative behaviors with the magician, really listen for Doug's explanation of the magician in its fullness, because it's so beautiful that when you can access the golden magician or magician in its fullness, which is hard to do, but when you can, far out Brussels sprout. It's it's full on, mate. It is
Level, man.
so beautiful. It's another level. It
Yeah, you're
really
creating environments. You're creating environments.
creating environments. I love that. I love that because that's exactly what Will Smith and Robin Williams do. Is it's narrative transportation. They invite you into a story where you forget about everything else happening around you. And so I'm curious I'd love to be a fly on the wall. Jay Shetty is Will Smith's life coach. And I'm curious to see the kind of session they had after the Oscars, to see where this man's hurting, in this unraveling and unpacking process at 54, however old he is. It's a big unpacking, man. When you've been one way and operating as this performer for so long, it takes those masks. It's like strapping tape on a hairy shin. It's hard to pull off. So I hope he gets the healing that he needs. I hope he's also held to account for how he needs to be held to account for his actions and his behaviors. But enough from us. Paul, thanks for joining us, mate. I'm really grateful that you've been able to spend this time with me. I love when we get to share the mic. True. And for those of you who have been enjoying this series, I hope you enjoy this episode with Doug Gillette as we dive into the magician archetype. Enjoy. G'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Clift, and we are joined again by Douglas Gillette for the third installment of our series on the archetype. Now, the magician archetype is one of the 4 basic building blocks of our psychology. We've previously covered the warrior in depth. We've gone through the lover. And now we come to the magician, who is often the most persecuted of the archetypes, the most bastardized in many ways, especially in many men's groups that I've been a part of. I myself have blamed that sneaky trickster on many of my my behaviors in the past. But this is one that, I mean, Doug and I are going to be challenged, I believe, to cover in depth in a relatively short period of time. But first things first, Doug, for those that may be joining us on this episode and haven't watched the subsequent previous ones, tell us a quick little bit about yourself and your work and your involvement with the archetypes.
Okay. I've been doing men's work, which was at a specific point in my life in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It was transformative for me. Both one-on-one individual work and men's groups, which I was a part of for a while as a member, as a participant, and then a facilitator. Co-authored, with Robert Moore, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, published in 1990, the archetypes of the mature masculine, of course, with their immature forms too.
Sure.
And subsequently the 4 within books, the King within, the Warrior within, the Magician within, the Lover within. And I will just say for my own life, this material that Robert and I, that emerged for us, and I would say partly, even largely from the Magician, was truly transformative for me. I, as the sort of complexes that I've been bedeviled by, my young life, my young adult life, early middle age, as they dissolved and disappeared, or were neutralized, I was free to be who I really am. And I was free to know what I really wanted in my life.
There you go. Beautiful. And you speak on my behalf as well as it relates to this work. King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, as I've elucidated many times through this series, has been a bedside Bible for me in many ways. It's been a map. It's been a flow chart. It's been a guide to help me better understand my behaviors and the man in the mirror.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful to have you here again, Doug. I feel like I get the, it's just a lucky and a pleasurable honor for me to be able to do this. But let's get stuck into it. Now, the layperson's kind of understanding in my mind of the different archetypes is you've got the warrior that's the doer. We have the lover that's the feeler. We have the king that can see, and then the magician that thinks, right? Just a very basic breakdown in my mind. And there's more complexities and nuances to the magician as we're going to get into. But first things first, let's just call out the elephant in the room. The magician archetype is oftentimes in our work the scapegoat, the archetype that is blamed for much of the shadow behaviors that I and many others have turned up with. So my first question for you, Doug, is twofold. Why is the magician so often blamed? And additionally, how has the magician been misrepresented in your opinion?
Okay. Let me start with this if I could. I think for men, at least, the lover and the warrior are the easiest to understand and to access. In a certain sense, they're the most instinctual too, built into our primate programs before, in the distant past, before the magician, which we'll talk obviously much more about soon, before the magician really fully came online. So they're the more basic and the more and easier to get a handle on and to understand emotionally as well as intellectually. The magician, in my view, stands just behind the warrior and the lover. If you envision playing cards or slates or something, lover, warrior, magician stands just behind them. And I think in human evolution was the latest of those three to show up with real force. So I think just built into the structure of the male psyche, excuse me, anyway, and into having some allergy issues this morning. The trees are pollinating.
Oh, it's springtime. No.
So the magician was last to the party in that sense of the three, and developed. And as it developed, it modulated and changed the warrior and the lover. So it's easy. Well, let me say this and then see where your initial questions are at. The magician is harder to get to because it's behind the most obvious archetypes, lover and warrior. It is maligned in part because it is not as easy to integrate as the lover and the warrior. It's not as obvious, not as easy to get to. And also, let me say this. I do think, and it's not just in men's work, it's across the board, that men who are thinkers, who are accessing the magician big time, are often viewed with suspicion. Are often, I mean, it's, the ivory tower intellectual, the effete elite, so there's resentment about that. And not all men have the interest, let's say, in thinking and in lifting that aspect of being human up. So, and I'm going to say this, and you'll probably get a lot of mail on this one, but I think that the part, I don't say everything, part of what's going on with the culture wars in this country and others is pushback against magician energy. I mean, think about the public health officials who've been pilloried. Think about the a really strong anti education bias.
Huge absence of trust.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's right to be suspicious to some degree of people who are thinking beyond what you've thought, or beyond, or who know things that you don't know. However, you know, the magician is the creator of civilization.
Yeah.
And without that, we'd still be scraping our, you know, what's with leaves. I mean,
it's interesting you say that, Doug, because I've recently been, you know, we've spoken previously as well. I'm a huge fan of Yuval Noah Harari and his book Sapiens, and many of the other kind of researchers that have gone into our human history. And in many ways, our human history, I believe, is ready for a retcon, you know, a rewriting in many ways. You know, we look at how we've, you know, how we exited the Stone Age immediately into the pyramids, right, of Giza, and these massive feats of and massive extensions of intellectual feats that we didn't have the technology at the time to create such things, yet this was happening across the globe relatively around the same time. And so many say that this magician archetype, this creator, this thinker, was the latest archetype to the party. Yet when it came in, when it finally was engaged and harnessed, look at what we created in such a short span of time relative to our history as a human species.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I think that it is the magician in the broadest sense that makes us what we are, that distinguishes us from our nearest closest animal relatives. I mean, think about it. If the magician and is responsible for our evolution as humans.
Oh, 2001. Sorry, Doug. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey. The monkeys in the beginning, right, picking up the tool, the club.
Right.
It was that.
That's magician.
Use. Yeah, the control of nature.
If you look at that, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you look at the earliest stone knapping archaeological sites and so forth, that took an enormous amount. I mean, it's not of magician. That's not just cracking a stone. This is very finely worked, and it gets more finely worked as time goes by. And it's also, in that sense, language capacity is magician, is a product of the magician, of intelligence rising. So, but you know, I mean, we are so damaged in the lover and to some degree in the warrior. I think that there is a suspicion and resentment rather than appreciation, love, and service to, in some ways, human intelligence. So I think that's part of the problem. Part of it is the evolutionary history. Part of it is clearly there are those who have, let's put it this way, greater or easier access to the magician than others. And we'll get into the shadow forms of the magician later. But people are rightfully suspicious of the shadow forms. However, they are wrongfully unappreciative of the magician in its fullness.
Yeah. An example of that for me is I was in a group of people, and I, as a millennial, was saying, all these baby boomers better stop pointing the finger and blaming us for ruining the world, because they rode the wave of like the greatest economic period in our human history, and they're blaming us for all the, and they've just set us up for this world of a lemon. Now, one of the men there said, yes, and show a little gratitude for how society has progressed during our time. And it really added another element to my stance on that, to go, oh, wow, okay, so this isn't just a one-sided blame party. It's a well, thank you for these things, and also we have a bit of a mess too that we have to clean up that was created
and
by a previous generation.
It's historical again. I mean, each generation builds on or tears down the achievements of the previous, and sometimes both at the same time. And well, here's another thing. At the same time, the magician, in a way, is the easiest to access of the three, lover, warrior, magician, because in this sense, it, as master of technology, it represents the fact, I think, that human beings are best at making gadgets.
Yes.
We're not so good at, in other words, we use the magician to make gadgets, to make stuff, a lot of which is wonderful, and there's a lot of blessing there, but a lot of which is also sowing the seeds of self-destruction. Think of climate, et cetera, and many other things. So in that sense, the gadget part, the master of technology, in a kind of a narrow sense, aspect of the magician, is very easy to draw upon.
Yeah, we have the intellectuals, we have in some cases the resources and the ability to create these things, and this in many ways I've seen representative as us trying to control nature, right? Which is the master of technology, that wing or that side of the magician. Yet there's this deeper element, right? As the knower magician. I mean, so I'd love to make the distinction there. In the book, you and Robert wrote, we believe this is the age of the magician because it is a technological age. It is an age of the magician, at least in his materialistic concern with understanding and having power over nature. But in terms of non-materialistic, psychological, or spiritual initiatory process, the magician energy seems to be in short supply.
Exactly.
So can you make the distinction between the magician as the master of technology, right? Transformation of the material world, and the magician as the knower, that inner transformation? Because there seems to be an imbalance between those two sides of the coin.
Yeah, and I think there always has been.
Okay.
At least so far as we've been human as we are. Master of tech, that master of technology thing is present in other animals as well. Animals, and even in a certain sense, plants, and fungi, let's put them all in there.
Yeah, sure.
Are, and bacteria, so on. Every organism and every group of organism knows that, not with self-reflection necessarily, but knows, is aware at some level that nature as a whole is both the nurturer and the enemy. So that it's the womb from which everything arises, all organic things too, organisms, and yet it also threatens.
It's the grave as well.
It's the grave as well.
It's the beginning and the end.
So everything that can, and to the limits of its ability, tries to defend itself against the rest of nature.
Good luck.
Well, I mean, that's why we have civilization. That's what civilization is a massive, massively mounted explicated, developed way for us to flourish against the pitiless forces and patterns in nature. That's what it is. And that's the magician that has helped us with that. That's how we have leaped, in a sense, far ahead. This is the magician, in that sense, is life's newest invention to protect itself, as well as from the inorganic world. So yeah, I mean, so every organism that gets a chance overdoes it, doesn't know where to stop. That was true in the earliest ecospheres 4 billion years ago. It's true now.
Yeah. Oh, it's the reason why there's, all the different species of homos, right? Homo erectus are no longer around.
Well, yeah, and it's why we have this threat to the environment. While
Bingo.
we were busy, while the magician was busy building technology ramparts against the threatening aspects of nature as a whole, we overdid it. We didn't know where to stop. We couldn't stop.
No.
And that's the danger. In a certain sense, then you could say, while the magician is not readily known or appreciated or accessed in a way, overall, it is responsible for our current situation. What else did you ask in there? You asked.
So speaking about the imbalance, you mentioned
the imbalance, right?
Yeah, because there's a short supply of the opposite. Right. So let's speak to the other side of the coin, is the knower.
So it's relatively easy to access, in a certain way, the master of technology, because it is of supreme survival value and obvious survival value. The knower, however, that's something else. The knower requires a deeper and a more and a wider perspective. The knower is harder to access than the master of technology, because it requires a lot of things that people don't want to do, like self-reflection, knowing oneself, which is most fruitfully done with knowledge of the dynamics and structures of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. Knowing oneself, knowing others in a deeper than superficial way, seeing the panoramic view of the global situation, the ecological situation, the et cetera, et cetera. It's harder. It's much harder. It takes a lot of work to get to. Yeah, in a sense, you could say the knower is, and I'm going to bracket this. The knower is about inner, and the master of technology is about outer. And it is easier to manipulate the outer than it is to access the unconscious or the semi-conscious and do the inner.
I have some ideas around that, because I can have a tendency to numb when I have some feelings that I don't want to address and don't want to look at, right? Inner stuff. It's very easy for me to have a beer or 3 at the end of the day to numb out any feelings that are arisen in me, versus journaling, meditating, investigating. So my brain has this mechanism, this side of the magician that can go, oh, well, there's a solution for that, Brandon. It may not be the best thing for you in the long run, but here is something that can stave off these feelings for now.
Mm-hmm.
It could be getting on a statin, for heart challenges, or knowingly, we know this stuff, taking better care of our health.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The magician has created these things to make things easier for us in the world, this express society that we have. And for good or for worse, it seems that
both.
For both, right? I think there's, you talk about in two sides. You have the side that's easier to access. Well, I can just create something to solve this problem. And then you have this Noah side, which is the harder to access. From my understanding of the magician, and this was taught to me many, many years ago by reading your book and also by sitting in men's circles, was that part of why the magician is so hard to access in its fullest is because what needs to occur. I mean, Robert wrote in his book, The Archetype of Initiation, if you cannot submit, you cannot die. And if you cannot die, you cannot get reborn. Mm-hmm. And the magician is the arbiter of that process, it seems. My greatest mentors in life, they've touched the stove. They've had that death. They can guide me through my hero's journey because they've done the hero's journey. They've been through it. They've gone through the deepest depths and the highest highs. And so it's all easy to say, well, just let go. The technologist side of the magician goes, no, we need to control the process and we need to control the outcome. Right. We only accept these outcomes. Whereas the Noah, let's go. And just whatever happens. That's so hard to do, especially as a man.
yeah, it is. And there's a real dilemma there. It's not a made up one or a matter of psychological deficiency in that sense. And that is, I think, as human beings, we walk on a knife's edge trying to figure out, trying to somehow balance these two aspects of the magician, which come up as feeling like control on the one hand and letting go, as you say, on the other hand. And the problem, as I see it, is that it's not an either or thing. You don't get off the knife's edge that easily.
Yeah.
You can't jump to one side or the other, because if we just let go in a passive sense and give up controlling, we're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean just metaphorically, as Robert is using that term in the Archetype of Initiation. That's a metaphorical death. It's an inner death. It's a psychological death. But if human beings just really literally let go, nature would fill the vacuum. On the other hand, our technology, which holds the destructive side for us of nature at bay, and in our personal lives, which, I mean, let's face it, if we didn't have the aggressive controller part of the magician functioning in our individual lives, where would we be? I mean, what could we achieve? What could we, for good as well as ill?
We wouldn't have penicillin,
right?
We wouldn't have all of these necessities that are crucial to our survival and thriving as well. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, the thing, I'm not going to criticize Hariri. I realize he's very popular right now.
Sure.
But I do think that he has, in Sapiens, he does have a kind of romantic view of the hunter-gatherer phase.
Yes.
And of human cultural development.
I can see why you say that. Yeah.
And it's like, what do? We give all of this up, and we go back to little bands of 20, 25, 50, and we eke out a living. Okay, we're quote unquote in harmony with nature.
I hope you're enjoying the Mankind Podcast. The Mankind Project supports all kinds of men with men's groups and programs aimed at building self-awareness, improving relationships, and upping your game. If you're ready to take that next step and you're a man of color, check out the men's work for BIPOC men at bit.ly/menswork3.
But there are diseases we can't do anything about. There are outbreaks of social disorder that we don't have the wisdom to deal with.
Yeah.
The hunter-gatherers, too, did not know where to stop.
No.
I mean, let's not be romantic about it.
No. Us versus them.
They didn't know where to stop either. And they decimated environments, too.
Yeah.
So
just
civilization,
look at
the magician would not have arisen to create all of this and unfortunately also put us in danger.
Yeah.
But it would not have arisen if hunter-gatherer life had been so wonderful.
Bingo. I mean, you look at an example, you know, the first sapiens to make it to Australia 50,000 years ago, the indigenous Australians. Within 5,000 years, they believe that 90% of the megafauna on the continent of Australia disappeared. Right. Just 10% of the time in which those indigenous Australians were there before we came along, which just gives you just kind of frames the impact, right? Of our control over nature, which for me in many ways, reading The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Have you read that?
No, I haven't read that one. No.
It's a wonderful book, and what it did for me was help me grasp the magician in many ways. So when I look at the person that can walk between both roles or both worlds of the magician in its fullness, the master of technology and then the knower, to me, alchemy really represents that. It's the both and, but it's also the question for me that often comes up in magician, and in many ways comes up in the work we do with the Mankind Project, is the question of what's at risk. What's at risk if you do? What's at risk if you don't? There is a cost, regardless, when it comes to
absolutely. In my view, we are the products of, we are the earth. The earth is a dangerous, whatever else we may be, we are expressions of earth. And earth is nurturing, abundance generating, flourishing, and it's a killer.
Cruel.
It's dangerous. And so, you know, as the earth in our form, I'm afraid there is no escape. I mean, as long from this dilemma.
Yeah. Mother Earth will win.
And technologist.
Yeah.
Because well, anyway, we're kind of wandering here, but in terms of our individual lives, these huge principles are present in each one of us, in the structures and dynamics of our psyches, of our lives. So what looks like a problem of evolution or the planet, and we are microcosms of that. And there's no way to escape, in my view. So the letting go that you're talking about, the submission, it reminds me of the AA prayer. How does that go?
The Serenity Prayer?
The Serenity Prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah. help me to know what I can change, and help me to know what I can't change. In other words, control stuff. And helping to control and let go, and helping to know the difference between the two. And
taking
this is all within the magician.
Taking this world as it is and not as I would have it.
Yeah. On the other hand, we do necessarily try to make it as we would have it.
Yeah.
As a species, as groups, as individuals. So, the 25 words or less thing, I think, is number one. There is no escape from the responsibility that we all have to take for the degrees and manners of control which we must exercise, and the letting go which we must also engage or access. There's no escape. So what's the best route for every single human being, in my view, balancing these energies of the magician? Well, it's depth self-reflection. What is that? That's depth psychology.
It's doing the work.
Doing the work.
It's funny how this always comes back to do your work.
Yeah, sorry, but we don't get out of the work until we die, and maybe not even then.
Perhaps.
But I mean, and the work, it does call us to be responsible, and it calls us to be responsible for what we are not responsible for. What's wrong with us, we're not responsible for, but we alone can take responsibility for it, right?
Yeah.
There is no one else to take the responsibility. So you can see why people in general give the wisdom part of the magician, the knower part, a wide berth.
Yeah.
Way too much work, folks.
Yeah.
And we're just using our gadgets over here to try to keep going and, if possible, flourish.
Oh, yeah. Yes. To avoid the discomfort, to avoid the spectrum of emotions that can come from inner work and the stickiness and the sludginess. And I empathize with every human being out there that just doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
Not today.
Yeah.
Not today.
No.
I
Right.
empathize for sure, but just know that's why we call it shadow. It's always there, whether you see it or not. It will follow you to your final breath.
Yeah, and maybe beyond. I mean, that's the I'm sorry to say that's our situation.
How true. Well, Doug,
I wanted to mention another aspect of the magician, well, a couple others that are related to these two that you very well have delineated: the knower and the master of technology. An additional thing that I think is extremely important: the magician is also, with knowledge and mastery. And by the way, that technology, I'm going to go do a sidebar here. That master of technology doesn't apply just to making gadgets, building pyramids, creating vaccines, etc. It also has, and societies of justice and fairness and so forth. It also has to do with inner technology. And that's part of that knower thing. We need to learn the structures and dynamics of the psyche. That's what analysis is all about. That's what depth therapy is all about.
That's what Jung has done, Freud. That's what.
Right. And become masters of inner technology, the technology that has to do with the structures and dynamics of the psyche. That's so that's part of the master of technology too, which is an aspect of the knower. So, but there's also this thing of the initiator of others. teaching, initiating
There you go.
others, which we're not fit to do until we've done a great deal of work with ourselves. And of course, nobody gets to complete the work in this life. You just don't. But at a certain point, the shamans, the teachers, the healers, the elders, etc., they do go one step further, hopefully with a great deal of knowledge, hopefully as masters of inner and outer, or at least inner technology, and initiate and teach others. Why? Because we rise and fall together. And ultimately, we are each other. So I've joked in some of my classes that when we do history of thought and so on, that I say 100% of humankind needs to be in therapy, and 95% of us need to be psychotropically medicated. So okay, I'm joking, sort of, but that's about lack of initiation. Lack of initiating others.
Comes back to the whole purpose behind this conversation,
right?
Is to talk about that initiation. I mean, you look at, so for me, in my mind, I mean, previously I mentioned these mentors that I know they've been through the gambit, they've touched the stove, they've experienced the death. We think of, in film, we've got Gandalf, we've got Yoda, we've got Obi-Wan. I mean, for me, the one who sticks out the most is Sean Maguire in Good Will Hunting, right? Robin Williams' character, that not only, I mean, how he plays the role for Will, this intellectual genius, but really this emotional toddler, is he's able to break down the ego of Will Hunting. He's able to address and speak directly and poke through the intellectual armor of Will Hunting, and to be able to hold him accountable for how he's leading his life. That only occurs from having been through the journey, from having really gone through that hero's experience, that hero's journey. And so hence why the magician can be so challenging for a young person like myself to engage in, as I'm just figuring things out, making my way through life. I think of the elders in the Mankind Project and how they can sit there in the West and they can sit there in that seat and say nothing all night and then come out with 2 or 3 words and bam, penny drop.
Right.
There's something about
that deep knowing and having been initiated, and sometimes, just talking practically about groups and so forth, sometimes, not always, because the master of technology and the knower is also the container and channeler. The psyche doesn't grow without being contained and channeled, and it takes, they talk about the vessel. You have to stay in the vessel and cook a while, but so those guys that can do that, let the group proceed in its perhaps chaotic and messy way,
always
who don't exercise control or containment at every in every moment, et cetera, but let the guys be as distracted and off the point in their consciousness as you can do, but then that final word or two or phrase or whatever, hopefully, if it is spoken, which I'm sure it is, with great wisdom, summarizing what has just happened and simultaneously leading to insight.
I've got a segue coming, Doug.
Okay.
So hopefully takes the embers of that environment, that container, and breathes in that wisdom, that eldership. But let's talk about shadow, because there are those that witness those moments, take those embers and manipulates it.
Okay. There's a good sense of manipulate and a bad sense.
Oh, come on, Doug, play with me. Like, I was really hoping you'd be like, yes, Brandon, let's go. Let's run with that.
Yeah, okay. We're going to do it. We're going to do it.
No, please.
In a certain way, teaching and initiating is manipulation.
Sure.
Of others, but not in a bad way. If it's done with wisdom and a good heart, it's for the good of of the individuals, of the group. But it is certainly true that, like everything else, almost everything else in human life, it's much easier to slide into the shadow, whatever we're doing, and in whichever archetype. Yeah, it's easy to do that. And then manipulation is a bad word. I just, taking your segue, go to the active pole of the magician's shadow: arrogant, withholding, power hungry, cynical, manipulative in a bad sense.
The detached manipulator, as it's been called.
Right. Right. And let me just say that to the magician, energy requires a certain amount of detachment.
Sure.
Right.
Objectivity.
Because
the judgment
outside of the dynamics of the lover and the warrior stuff and so on, in order to modulate it, which we'll get to in a minute, right? How the magician modulates the lover and the warrior without dissing them. But just to stay with the active pole, the magician, whether it's active or passive, the shadow, is arrogant. It withholds the information and or the process that would allow others to share in knowledge, wholeness, etc.
Yeah.
So, and why does it do that? It's power hungry.
Mm-hmm.
This is the power side of the shadow magician, which you see. I mean, you talk about everywhere. Manipulation of so many companies, businesses, the whole rationale for whether it's capitalism, communism, something in between, it's about manipulation. It's about with media, withholding the knowledge that you have that would help.
I mean, you and Robert did such a great job elucidating this, saying that this is the energy form that seeks the fall of great men, that delights in the destruction of a man of importance. But the trickster does not want to replace the man who has fallen. He does not want to take up the man's responsibilities. In fact, he doesn't want any responsibilities. He wants to do just enough to wreck things for others. And I can see how withholding information does that as well.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you look at drug companies. We have the ability to do such remarkable things. Look at Tesla and Elon Musk. Look at the rockets they're sending into space. Yet, and I'm getting on my post here. Many who know me know that my fiance is a cancer survivor. Drug companies make more money on cancer than just about any other disease.
Right, of course.
I'm going to be bold and say this, and people can refute this. Please feel free. How the F do we not have a cure for cancer, yet we can fix just about everything else? That, to me, in my belief, I could be wrong, is the withholding of information.
Yeah. To take an obvious example, it seems very clear, and I don't want to caricature or anything else, but in the current immediate situation of Russia over Ukraine,
Yeah.
and I know that nobody gets to be a saint here, nobody gets to be an angel. Nobody, it's not as simple as the bad guys and the good guys and that. However,
Yeah.
None of us gets to be the good guys, and the bad guys in a simple way. But look at how much information is being withheld by the elites in Russia from their own people, of course.
Bingo. The propaganda.
Right. And this is not new. I mean, this isn't the first time this ever happened. This is usual. I mean, but whenever you see information being withheld, whenever you see the arrogant affirmation of power, you are looking at the magician, the active pole of the magician's shadow.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go into all the examples, because all you have to do is, well, you don't even have to walk out your front door. You just turn on the TV or get on the internet, and it's everywhere.
Everywhere.
And okay, there's this passive pole, which you alluded to before, that Robert and I talk about as the naive, in quotes, and innocent one, in quotes. The passive pole of the magician is also arrogant. But in contrast to the active pole at least is doing work, right? It's generating the information which it withholds, and it's generating the power which it holds. And it's, the passive pole is not only arrogant, but it is also lazy. It's the lazy, the know nothing. It is passive aggressive. Well, so is the active pole in a way, but the passive pole, the naive one, the naive knower, knows more than it wants to admit that it knows. But let's say it knows a lot less than certainly than the magician in its fullness. Because of that, it is bedeviled by envy. The passive magician's shadow is envious of those who are not lazy. It's envious of those who do the work. It's envious of those who really do know. And consequently, out of its envy, it is secretly hostile to those with knowledge and experience.
I see a strong similarity here, Doug, to and we're going to get into this with the king in our next episode, but the weakling king that undermines and rusts. I see some close connection here.
All the archetypes are, you're right. All the archetypes, I mean, they're distinguishable from each other. And yet they do overlap, and they do draw on both in their fullness and in their shadow manifestations. They all do draw on common themes in human life.
That's very true. I mean, that is evident from my work in this. And just quickly, Doug, quick time check. I know we were set for the hour. Is there any spillover time that you can allow?
Yeah, could we go like 10 minutes more?
10 minutes. Okay, cool. We'll keep.
I mean, if we can,
we'll keep it.
We could do this for 3 hours, or more. But,
easy.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's roll into the gold, and something just to quickly mention that we've done in previous episodes, but not yet here, is how we go from gold to shadow. My understanding is that comes from judgment and story. It comes from unfounded feelings or awareness of a situation can make us fall into that shadow. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, yes, ignorance.
Ignorance. But yeah,
You know,
that sums it.
Yeah. We all have to make decisions, in case we haven't noticed, in life with insufficient data. Always insufficient data.
Yeah.
However, there's simply that fact on the one hand. On the other hand, there's willful ignorance. And willful ignorance, I don't think we do this in King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, but I think that willful ignorance is a part of laziness, and consequently part of the passive pole, shadow of the magician.
Because it's not making the effort to look at things holistically,
right,
from all angles. It's, I don't care if I believe the sky is green and grass is blue. That's my belief, and I'm going to stick with it. And all the binary thinking that is attached with that.
yeah. Don't confuse me with the facts. You know.
Yeah.
So I do want to mention that, because we started with the lover and the warrior, in front, the magician, the later development of human intelligence and capacity for reflection, as well as gadget making and so forth, technology. The magician can, I mean, and that's what the groups, men's groups and other groups, are dedicated to initiating and growing, you know, the psyche, rely on. The magician moderates the warrior and moderates the lover.
Yeah.
So that there must be some, there needs to be some careful, you know, looking at and evaluating and exercising some kind of control over, channeling, containing, you know, injecting wisdom into the warrior and the lover. So that I think the magician archetype modulates and balances, it regulates, it helps with reasoning, which is kind of a bad word now, reason, because of the partial failure of the Enlightenment project of everything is can be reasonably resolved. But nonetheless, reasoning is important. When you're about to be overly aggressive or even violent, verbally, emotionally, physically, you need the magician in that moment. That's for sure. To wait a minute. Let's think about this. Let's see if there's another way to channel that energy.
No, they're not going with the crowd. They're not going with the consensus. It's the ability to separate and look at it. I mean, I just wrote some notes on the Golden Magician. It has the ability to deconstruct the ego, keep our grandiosity in check. I mean, that is the most common thing when it comes to my mentors, is they see me and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this and that and this and that. And they come in and they put my feet on the ground. There's thoughtfulness and reflection, insight and wisdom, and the ability, coming back to arrogance, to deflate our arrogance.
Well, and as applied to the lover, think about, and I'm not pointing fingers or anything else, but think of all the stuff that's coming to the surface through the Me Too movement and so forth. And of course, this is not just a problem with men. There are women that have a very similar issue.
This is an us problem.
Yeah, it's a human problem. Maybe because of testosterone and so forth and cultural prejudices, it is more of a male problem. I certainly would agree with that than it tends to be, or it comes out differently in women. But once, you know, the lover, unchecked by the magician, will run amok.
Absolutely.
So the magician
Yeah.
is like, wait a minute, pause and think what you're doing. Are you using your sexuality? Are you using your power? Are you to wisely here? I mean, yes, I know you want to,
Have sex.
yeah. Or yes, I know you want to take a baseball bat or a gun to your neighbor, but wait a minute. Let's think about this, and not just about the consequences, but about the moral and ethical jeopardy and self-destruction mode that it puts you in. Self-destruction.
What's the cost? What's at risk?
What's the cost? Yeah. To you.
Yeah.
As well as others.
That, and again, that's part of the processes that we use in our men's circles is what's the impact on you and what's the impact of others to really set the context and set the scene. Doug, I want to ask you, I mean, we've touched on it many times, I'm sure, within this episode, but just kind of a summary for those of us when, not if, but when we're in the shadow magician, whether in the active or the passive pole. And I know that the lines between the passive and the active with the magician are very, very fine. What does the journey to fullness look like?
Well, first of all, the journey to accessing the magician in, let's say, its fullness, does require the magician.
How so?
Yeah. So that if you're not accessing the magician in its fullness adequately, consequently you're in one or both of the shadow modes, you need the magician that another, in the case of men's groups, man has accessed.
Guidance.
The only way out of the shadow magician is containment, guidance, wisdom, master of technology of another man who is accessing the magician adequately.
Yeah.
The only way out of the shadow magician is through the magician.
Wow.
But in this case, it has to be another man.
Yeah. And then we can submit and let go.
Yeah.
Because the container's there.
Right.
Well, Doug, mate, every time we do one of these, I go, that was the best one. That was the best one. And so now we are knocking on the door of the king, the final of the 4 foundational archetypes, where we go from there, I believe conversations around Access Mundi and, channeling all of them together. But next we have the king. I want to ask you, Doug, what excites you the most about conversations around the king, the sovereign archetype?
Questions about or attempts to see and feel issues like benevolence, service, leadership with benevolence and with the goal of service, and then the failures to, of course, in the shadow form, the failures to get to that, to embody those positive qualities of leadership.
There you go. For me, what excites me about our next conversation around the king is the conversation of the internal and the external, right? How turning up in my gold, full, sovereign place impacts and knocks on to that around me, those around me.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that I feel many of these, all the archetypes we've mentioned the necessity of turning up, of where we need these energies. The king for me, though, that's been my greatest teacher. That's been my greatest guide to understanding boundaries, to understanding those who I surround myself with, to understanding vision for my life and where I want to go, where I want to take those around me that I love, then co-creating that vision with others. The me and the us element that comes into that is what gets me most excited. So
Well, we'll have a lot of excitement then.
there we go.
From your end and from my side.
It's oozing. Well, Doug, Gillette, mate, what can I say? Thank you again for this deeply insightful and powerful conversation.
And you are more than welcome, and thank you for the work that you're doing, and to bring these things to these archetypal resources to light, and to show men how to invite them into their lives in their fullness, and what the pitfalls are if you don't. So
bingo. I'm telling you, I'm planting this seed right now. There has got to be a children's book.
Okay.
On these archetypes.
Okay.
That introduces them early.
Okay.
Early. Anywho, just planting that seed. I want to thank those of you that have joined us for this episode, our Mankind podcast family. You know, where depending when this episode is released, right now we're at 60 episodes, and we're only beginning. The more we expose ourselves as hosts and you as listeners to incredible thinkers and feelers, researchers, and everything in between, like Doug, this is where we as human beings can really pick up the pen, because fate is a horrible writer. Let's never leave our story in the hands of fate. We got to pick up the pen. We got to take that responsibility, and we've got to write. And the best way we can do that is by being informed and doing the work. Doug, until next time, to those of you that are listening today, lots of love. See you next week.
Likewise.
Well, there you have it. Another powerful episode of the Mankind podcast. I don't know about yourself, but I am absolutely beaming having been a part of this series. We have been getting a lot of emails from all of you just after the Lover episode was released about the impact that it's having on you, which just really fills me with joy, because these archetypes, you know, although just a framework, have really helped frame my men's work journey for me. I've said that many times throughout these series, but it is so helpful to at least have a model to understand my behaviors and not just look at it from a binary stance of, oh, that's good behavior or bad behavior, to be able to diagnose it, as well as know that there is a path to fullness, to gold, out of shadow. For each of these is so remarkably helpful. So if you yourself really are finding yourself feeling into your magician right now, or perhaps thinking into your magician, just know that the journey back to fullness, although a very tough journey, the way to do it is to let go, which is so hard. How hard is it for us, especially if you're listening and you identify as male? Letting go is very, very, very difficult. Letting go of outcomes, letting go of the path or the process. So my recommendation for you, if you're really sitting in this space right now and wanting to tap into that magician energy, you know, commit to learning. Remember, the magician is the creator, right? It's the initiator. And so with that comes the commitment to learning. Take time to meditate, create more, consume less, start working with your hands. Perhaps take part in a rite of passage, find a mentor, become a mentor, or if you're feeling called, find a men's group where we use these archetypes to frame our conversations, to frame connection. We're starting to see new warrior trainings open up again as well. So if you have yet to initiate into the Mankind Project, be sure to go to mkpusa.org and check out, see if there's trainings near you. And for those of you as well who have initiated, we got trainings. Trust me, we're having no trouble filling them right now. However, we do need men to staff them. So if you feel called to get back into the work, I know it's been a while since we've been in person, but there are trainings all over the States that need good men to staff right now. Well, I hope you're enjoying this series so far, and I hope you're looking forward to our next episode as we dive into that beautiful sovereign energy of the king. This is one that, a conversation that meant the world to me. For those who are in the Mankind Project, you know that you get you kind of claim a spiritual name or an animal name. And mine is King Chimp, or Chimpanzee Rey, as it was identified when I was down in Mexico staffing. So bring that sovereign energy on. I think you're going to love this interview, and it'll be the second last of our series before we get together for a group panel to talk about how we bring all these energies together. So until then, I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you for the next episode of the Mankind Podcast. Lots of love. See you then. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Paul Newell, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, we've got to give special thanks to our back-end team, producer, editor, and audio ninja for the show, Michael J. Russer, and Don Huff, who takes care of our graphics and promotions and pretty much makes us look pretty. So, of course, thank you, Don. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. What it means for Paul, what it means for Boyson, that is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.